Thumbs up?
Yes, I do.
Perfect. Thanks a lot for joining me today. There's a lot on the ballot this year in Colorado. I just got my blue book in the mail today that explains, it's more than 100 pages long, that explains all the things we get to vote on here in Colorado in November. Today I'm going to talk about the Gallagher Amendment specifically and what we're voting on with Amendment B. So the first part of my presentation, I'm just going to go a little background about how Gallagher works, how it impacts the state budget, and how that could impact our contributions for para. So a little bit of background about that first, then we'll talk about a little bit of Gallagher, and then explain what Amendment B is that we're voting on our November ballot. Okay? So remind ourselves, we are a citizens initiative state, which means we as voters get to decide on a lot of things. We've put a lot of things in our Constitution as voters. We've legalized marijuana. We've raised the minimum wage through the citizens initiative process. One of my favorites is GOCO, Colorado. Basically, most states take their lottery dollars and use it to pay for schools and senior services. Colorado voters said back in the early 90s, nah, we love our bike paths and we love our green space, so let's take our lottery money and use it to pay for parks and bike paths. That's just one of the many things we as voters in a citizens initiative state get to vote on. Well, there's a lot of things we're voting on in this 2020 ballot, and one of them is the repeal of the Gallagher Amendment, or Amendment B. So to understand Amendment B, let's take a step back and first build the building blocks of the state budget. Here's a look at the last year's state budget, just to understand where all your tax dollars go. Or you could think of it a different way. For every dollar you give Colorado in income tax or sales tax, about 36 cents goes to schools. Another 26 cents goes to healthcare. Most of this is Medicaid. And then our human services, our colleges, and our prisons get about 9 cents of every income tax, sales tax we give the state of Colorado. Our roads get a little less than two pennies last year. So to give you an idea of what our general fund, our big state budget really is buying, it's a lot of schools, it's healthcare, Medicaid, it's colleges, prisons, and it's human services. And also out of this pot of money is our contribution that the state helps to keep up with our para payments. So when you're thinking about where that money comes from for the state contribution for para, it's also from this same source. Okay. The real question then is why does something like the Gallagher Amendment, which we're going to talk about in a second, it impacts local property taxes, but how does something that impacts your local property taxes influence the state budget? And to understand why there's an impact from Gallagher on the state budget, you have to understand how schools are funded. We fund schools two different ways. There's the state contribution for schools, and a lot of that state contribution comes out of the general fund. So about $4.5 billion comes out of the state general fund and other state sources to pay for schools. The other third comes from your local property taxes, mostly local property taxes. And so last year, the split was about 1/3 local, 2/3 state. Now the key here to understanding how local property taxes can impact the state budget, if this part of the pie falls, the local funding for schools, that means the state, from the state sources, is on the hook to pay for more of schools. And that's kind of the punchline of what happened with the Gallagher Amendment from the last 3 decades, is we've lowered our property taxes on our houses, and it forces the state to kick in more to pay for schools from the state budget. Okay? So brief dive into Gallagher. Gallagher was a Colorado constitutional amendment we added in 1982. Back in 1982, we were trying to solve a fairness issue. Before 1982, you paid property tax on your home based on the value of when you bought the property. So you can see how this would be unfair. If you're a couple that bought your home in 1980, you're in the exact same neighborhood, but your neighbor bought the same home in 1940, and they were paying a fraction of the property taxes that you were paying. So Gallagher meant to solve that issue. It said we would just reappraise property every 2 years. So that really wasn't controversial. The part of Gallagher that has lasting implications, that's impacting our state budget and local budgets today, is what we call the 45-55 split. Gallagher said in simplified version, we will only be allowed to collect 45% of property taxes from housing. And the remaining 55% has to come from non-residential. And non-residential means commercial, agricultural, oil and gas. Everything that's not housing property is in the non-residential side of things for Gallagher. And then we have the residential side of things for Gallagher. Okay? A little more background. This is really wonky stuff on property taxes, but you don't pay property taxes on the entire value of your home, only a portion of it, or what we call the assessed value. So for instance, you first take your $350,000 market value home and you multiply it by the statewide assessment rate. That gives you your assessed value. And then in the property tax world, we have a thing called mills. Mills are just a fancy word for the rate you pay for property taxes. So you pay mills for your schools, and you pay mills for your sheriff, and mills for your fire district, and mills for your county. Maybe you're in a library district. Those are your mills that support all your local governments. Okay? Back when Gallagher passed, the assessment rate on residential was 21%. And the assessment rate for everything else, non-residential, was 29%. But since the 1980s, the growth in market value of residential greatly outpaced the value of everything else. And the seesaw was out of whack. In order that the state only collect 45% of property taxes from housing, that assessment rate had to be lowered and lowered and lowered and lowered. So it fell to 18%, and then like 16%, and 15%, and 12%, and 10%. It recently fell to 7.15%. Okay? It had been at 7.96% since 2003. So for about 15 years, it had been at 7.96%. And then recently in 2017, it fell to 7.2%. This will be part of the story in a second. But another way of looking at kind of the 45-55 split, if you really want to show why we're not taking advantage of all the growth in residential property, statewide, if you look at market value, the market value of all property in the state is about 80% residential. And that means the non-residential makes about 20% of the overall market value. But Gallagher has to squish that 80% of residential value into only 45% of the property taxes. And so what that ultimately means then is, as we lowered the assessment rate on homes, so we could only capture 45% of property taxes from homes, we collect a lot less money locally. And going back to my school pie, remember today, about 34% of the school pie comes from local sources. In the early 80s, it was more than half came from local sources. This is back when we were above the national average in per pupil spending. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the assessment rate on residential property was 21%. Now it's 7.15%. So we collect a lot less property taxes on the value of our homes, which means the state has to kick in a lot more to pay for schools, which then that means we squeeze out things like colleges and healthcare and road funding and human services funding, para funding, because we're basically subsidizing schools, subsidizing low property taxes through the school finance formula. If you look where we rank, our latest census rankings has us at 48th. On how much property taxes we pay per dollar of value of our homes. So if you have a $350,000 home in Colorado, you pay on average $1,700 in property taxes. New Jersey's the highest. If you move that $350,000 home to Jersey, you'd pay about $8,500. If you move it to Texas, you'd pay about $6,200. But then again, you would not pay any income tax in Texas. So balancing out rates between income sales and property rankings is tricky. But we definitely are very low on property taxes on homes. And a lot of that has to do with the fact the Gallagher Amendment keeps on lowering the residential assessment rate. Again, when Gallagher was passed, the assessment rate on housing was 21%. Now it's 7.15%. So if you do the math on what you pay, business property is paying 4 to 1 what housing property is paying. If you have a $350,000 house, you first multiply that by the assessment rate. And then on average, in Colorado, it's about 80 mills. It depends on where you live, what school district you're in, what county you're in, etc. But say on average it's 80 mills. A $350,000 house pays about $2,000 in property taxes. A $350,000 shop, commercial property, is assessed at the 29% rate and then gets multiplied by the mills. So the same value commercial property is paying 4 to 1 what housing pays in property taxes. Now, a little other wrinkle that goes into the Gallagher property tax thing that's probably something that your audience is interested in, and that's the Homestead exemption. So Colorado gives a property tax break for people who are over 65 and who have lived in their home for 10 years. The property tax Homestead exemption exempts basically $100,000 worth of market value. Specifically, it exempts 50% of the first 200. But as long as your house is worth more than 200, the Homestead exemption basically wipes away $100,000 of value before you run your property tax calculation. So going back to my $350,000 home, if you have the Homestead exemption, you only have a $250,000 home in your calculation. And that gets multiplied by the assessment rate, which then gets multiplied by mills. And so last year, on average, the Homestead exemption reduces property taxes for those who qualify by about $600. Now that's something that the legislature can cancel. Back during the last recession, it did zero out the Homestead, and we didn't give, for several years in a row, that property tax break to seniors because the state has to pay for it. They did keep the property tax exemption this budget year, even though it was a very difficult budget year with the COVID recession. Okay. So this year, we're a really weird world. We're in a recession caused by the coronavirus. And the last several years, the assessment rate on housing had to be lowered because basically there's been a giant growth in residential value around Denver metro area. My house in Denver went up like 30% in 2 years. So I'm super blessed. But that means all that growth in value around Denver, statewide, because the state can only collect 45% of property taxes from residential property, that assessment rate has to keep on being lowered. Well, this year it's a little different because with the coronavirus recession, the drop in travel and the drop in oil and gas value, the drop in no one's working in downtown anymore, they're working from home. So we had a huge drop in commercial property and oil and gas property. That's the other part of the seesaw. So we still have moderate growth in residential, but since the other part of the seesaw is going down, it's screwing up the 45-55 split. And so next year they're projecting to maintain the Gallagher 45-55 split. The assessment rate that's currently at 7.15% will have to fall to 5.88%. So that's an 18% drop in the residential assessment rate. What that means is all that residential value that was paying 80 mills now has a lot less assessed value times those 80 mills. And go back to the school finance world, the calculations mean that if that assessment rate falls automatically because of the Gallagher Amendment, it means about $490 million less dollars given to schools through the property tax side. And then you also pay mills to your county. They estimate that if that falls to 5.88%, it will reduce county budgets by about $200 million. And then also there's these small local special districts like your library district, or particularly your fire protection district that relies solely on property taxes, there's probably several hundred million lost from those special districts as well, because of the automatic lowering of the residential assessment rate. Okay. Now this impacts different parts of the state in different ways. In Denver, it's not as much of a problem. Going back to my house, the last time we lowered the residential assessment rate significantly was 2017. It dropped from 7.96% to 7.2. So that was a 10% drop. But the value of my property in Denver grew by 30%. So Denver, my fire district in Denver, my fire protection district, still generated more money on my house. I paid them more money the next year. Even though my house grew by 30%, the residential assessment rate fell by 10, I was still paying more, and my fire protection district didn't struggle as much. But go to like a place like Kremling or Eastern Plains or the San Luis Valley or rural Colorado. Say you only have 2% growth in housing value, but Gallagher ratcheted down the assessment rate by 10%. There were a lot of rural local governments that actually collected less money the following year because of the Gallagher Amendment. The drop in the residential assessment rate is statewide. It's a weird dynamic where a bunch of growth in Denver in housing can force budget cuts to, say, fire districts in Lamar or Kremling or Alamosa. Back in 2018 was, again, another bad fire year like this year. We had a lot of these fire districts that were struggling because the assessment rate fell 10% that year, and they're in really rural areas that didn't have the market value growth in property. And so there were a lot of fire districts that saw big reductions in their revenue because of the Gallagher Amendment. That's why a lot of fire districts, if you've been following this stuff, a lot of fire districts have tried to de-Gallagherize, or basically go to a local vote that says, if the residential assessment rate falls, we'll ask permission of voters to float our mills. And so we'll basically keep us even. That's why you saw a lot of fire districts, particularly rural fire districts and mountain fire districts, went to voters in the last 2 years, asking them to kind of fix the Gallagher problem for them locally. So you might, if you're in some of these districts, might see a local de-Gallagherizing thing, which is confusing because there's also the statewide Gallagher issue. That's Amendment B. So that's 20 minutes of long explanation of understanding what we're voting on with Amendment B. Amendment B asks to repeal the Gallagher Amendment. What that really means is the current assessment rate is 7.15%. If Amendment B doesn't pass, Gallagher will automatically lower that residential assessment rate to 5.88%. That means a $500 million hit to schools, $200 million to county budgets, a big drop in local property taxes to give us homeowners an automatic property break. And it's significant. For every $100,000 of home value, that drop is probably worth $100. So you have a $400,000 home in Colorado, allowing that assessment rate to fall saves you $400. Which also means, though, it's millions of dollars taken from our schools and our fire districts and our county budgets. Amendment B would ask to repeal the Gallagher Amendment. A repeal of the Gallagher Amendment would keep these assessment rates from falling. Instead of dropping to 5.88%, it would just stay at 7.15%. It would also take the 29% rate that commercial non-residential values assessed at, and would give the legislators the ability to lower the rates in the future if they wanted to. Right now, legislators can't give a break to business by lowering this 29% rate because it's locked into our state constitution. A vote for Amendment B would repeal the Gallagher Amendment and would allow the ability of legislators to give commercial property a break. It would also prevent this the rate on homes from falling automatically. Okay. So that is the 20-minute deep dive into Gallagher state budget, interconnection from schools, local property taxes, and state budgets.